It was the kind of night that wrapped the sleepy New England town of Blackwood Hollow in a suffocating blanket of silence. The moon hung high in the sky, its silvery light barely penetrating the dense mist creeping through the streets like a ghostly tide. It was a night for secrets and for fear. Martha Winters clutched her coffee mug, staring out the window of her modest home at the edge of Blackwood's dense forest. It had been 3 weeks since the first disappearance. 16-year-old Jamie Farrell, a bright-eyed, ever-smiling boy, had vanished on his way home from football practice. No trace of him had been found. The town's unease had only deepened when Amanda Reed, the librarian's quiet daughter, went missing a week later. Now, with the total count at 5, all young, all healthy, all inexplicably gone, Blackwood Hollow was drowning in paranoia. The forest, once a place of summer picnics and fall hikes, was now the center of every whispered suspicion. Martha's daughter, Emily, had insisted on joining the search party that evening. At 17, Emily was fiery and fearless, traits that had always made Martha both proud and terrified. As the clock struck midnight, the familiar creak of the front door broke the silence. "Mom, I'm back," Emily called, her voice steady but soft. Martha sighed in relief. "Did you find anything?" she asked as Emily entered the living room, her face flushed from the cold. Emily shook her head, pulling off her scarf. "Nothing, but we heard something weird out by the old Larson cabin." Martha's blood ran cold. The Larson cabin had been abandoned for decades, ever since the family, a reclusive couple and their young daughter, had disappeared without a trace. Local legends spoke of curses and restless spirits, with eerie tales of strange sounds and shadowy figures often whispered among the townsfolk. But Martha had always dismissed them as nonsense. Still, the mention of that place now made her chest tighten. "We'll go back tomorrow with more people," Emily said, clearly undeterred. Martha wanted to argue, but the determination in her daughter's eyes silenced her. Instead, she simply nodded. The next day, a group of 8, including Emily and her best friend Jake, headed toward the Larson cabin. The air grew colder as they approached, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. The cabin itself was a skeletal shadow of its former self, its wooden walls warped and weathered. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently as if beckoning them inside. Emily stepped forward, flashlight in hand. "Let's split up. Cover more ground." Jake frowned. "Bad idea. You've seen horror movies, right?" Emily smirked. "It's an old cabin, not a haunted house." But her bravado wavered as she crossed the threshold. The air inside was thick, oppressive, carrying the faint scent of decay. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beams as they moved cautiously through the rooms. In what had once been the living room, they found a crude circle drawn on the floor, its lines etched into the wood as if by claws. Symbols surrounded the circle, their meanings indecipherable, but undeniably sinister. "This is bad," Jake muttered, stepping back. Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural whisper filled the room. It was not a voice, but a sound, like wind dragging through hollow bones. Emily spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but nothing was there. The whisper came again, louder this time, curling around them like smoke. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice trembling. Emily nodded reluctantly, but as they turned to leave, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the cabin, and the whispering grew into a cacophony of overlapping voices, each one dripping with malice. The group panicked, scrambling toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. Emily's heart raced as she banged on the wood, her own screams drowned out by the ghostly chorus. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Emily turned to see Jake staring at something behind her, his face pale as death. Slowly, she followed his gaze. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was a child, a girl no older than 6, with long, tangled hair obscuring her face. She wore a white dress, stained and tattered, and her bare feet left dark, wet prints on the floor. "Help me," the girl whispered, her voice thin and fragile. Emily took a step forward, but Jake grabbed her arm. "Don't!" he hissed. "That's not a child. The girl's head snapped up, revealing hollow, blackened sockets where her eyes should have been. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, jagged teeth glinting in the faint light. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. Emily screamed as the girl lunged, her movements jerky and inhuman. The flashlight slipped from her hand, plunging the room into darkness. She felt Jake's grip on her arm, and together they stumbled toward the door. With a sudden burst of strength, they managed to force it open, spilling out into the cold night air. The others were already outside, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. Without a word, the group fled, not stopping until they reached the edge of the forest. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The girl's empty eyes haunted her, and the whispers seemed to echo in her mind. She sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the forest. The town's lights flickered in the distance, but the darkness of the woods was impenetrable. At 3 a.m., her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness of the night. The screen lit up with a text from Jake. "Come outside, it's urgent." Confused, she grabbed her jacket and stepped into the chilly night. Jake was waiting at the edge of her driveway, his face pale and drawn. "What's wrong?" she asked. "We need to go back," he said, his voice shaky. "I saw her. She was at my window." Emily's stomach churned, but she nodded. Together, they made their way back to the cabin, armed with flashlights and the town's only priest, Father O'Brien. He had been skeptical at first, but Jake's desperation had convinced him. As they approached the cabin, the air grew colder, the whispers starting again. Father O'Brien clutched his rosary, murmuring prayers under his breath. The door was still ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, the symbols on the floor glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The girl was waiting for them, standing in the center of the circle, her head tilted unnaturally as she stared at them with those empty sockets. Father O'Brien stepped forward, holding up his crucifix. "In the name of the Lord, I command you to leave this place." The girl let out a bone-chilling scream, her body convulsing. Shadows erupted from her, writhing and twisting, filling the room with an impenetrable darkness. Emily felt a force slam into her chest, knocking her to the ground. She crawled toward the door, Jake's shouts barely audible over the deafening roar. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The cabin was silent, the girl was gone, and the symbols had vanished. Father O'Brien helped them to their feet, his face pale but resolute. "It's over," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. In the weeks that followed, the disappearances stopped, and life in Blackwood Hollow slowly returned to normal. But Emily knew it wasn't over. Late at night, when the world was silent, she could still hear the whispers, faint but insistent, calling her back to the forest.